It was late September when I decided to hitchhike back home from my cousin's wedding in a small town in Pennsylvania. I'd always been cautious about hitchhiking, but I had underestimated the stretch of road I had to cover, and my bus had left earlier than expected. The sun was dipping low over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet, and the air had that crisp bite that tells you autumn is really here. I stuck my thumb out and tried to look like someone people would feel safe picking up. My first ride was a middle-aged man in a beat-up pickup who smelled faintly of cigarettes and old coffee. He dropped me off at the next town after about 20 miles, and I thanked him, relieved to be moving. But as evening approached, the traffic thinned, and the isolated stretches of road began to feel uneasy. I was standing on a particularly desolate highway when a black SUV pulled over. The windows were tinted, but I could make out a figure behind the wheel. I waved, hopeful for a ride. The SUV slowed and stopped. The window rolled down, and a man in his mid-30s with dark hair and a kind smile greeted me. "Hey, need a ride?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to get back to Harrisburg," I said. "Hop in," he said, patting the passenger seat. I climbed in, trying not to show my relief. The interior of the SUV smelled faintly of pine and something metallic like faint rust. He didn't ask too many questions at first, just small talk about the weather, the roads, and the occasional joke. But after a few minutes, the conversation took an odd turn. "So, do you usually hitchhike alone?" he asked, eyes briefly glancing at me, then back to the road. "Not usually," I said, feeling a small chill. "Just tonight, I guess I had no other choice." He nodded slowly, and for a while, the car was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Then he asked, "Ever get picked up by someone you shouldn't?" I laughed nervously. "I guess tonight could count." He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. There was something calculating in the way he looked at me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease began to creep into my chest. The road was nearly empty, and the sun had disappeared behind the hills. The headlights of the SUV cut a narrow path through the darkness. "You know," he said suddenly, "most people don't survive long out here alone at night." I swallowed hard. "I think I'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't reply, and the silence returned. After another 10 minutes of driving, I noticed we weren't on any main road I recognized. The street signs were unfamiliar, and the GPS on my phone had no signal. I felt my stomach tighten. "Where are we exactly?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced at me briefly. "Just a shortcut. Trust me, it'll save time." I wanted to argue, but something about the way he said it made me hesitate. The road narrowed, winding through dense trees. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the glow of the headlights. The air inside the SUV had grown heavier, and I felt a bead of sweat on my temple despite the chill. Minutes passed, then he turned onto an even smaller dirt path. I could barely see the road, and the trees seemed to close in on us from both sides. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice quivering slightly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's the right way. Just stay calm." I tried to focus on breathing slowly, pretending nothing was wrong. But every instinct in my body screamed that something was off. The dirt path twisted deeper into the woods, and the SUV bounced over unseen potholes. Then, without warning, the car slowed to a stop. "I need to check something up ahead," he said, and the words sounded rehearsed, like he had said them 100 times before. What do you mean?" I asked, panic rising. He turned toward me. "Just wait here." Before I could protest, he opened his door and stepped out into the darkness. The headlights illuminated the thick forest ahead, but he disappeared into the shadows within seconds. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it from wherever he went. I considered running, but the car doors were locked, and my phone still had no signal. I sat frozen, listening. The only sounds were the distant hum of cicadas and the crunch of leaves under what I hoped were his boots. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere in the woods. I froze completely. My mind screamed at me to unlock the door and run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The growling stopped, replaced by the snap of a twig and soft, deliberate footsteps approaching the car. My breath caught when I saw his silhouette return to the headlights, but he wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were dark, cold, and unreadable. "Let's go," he said. opening the door. I climbed in silently, my hands trembling. The SUV roared to life and sped down the dirt path. I kept my eyes on the forest, looking for anything unusual, but it seemed empty. Too empty. The man didn't speak, and I didn't either. Eventually, the dirt path merged onto a paved road, but I still didn't recognize it. The man seemed unusually familiar with the area, taking turns I couldn't place and avoiding any signs that might indicate a nearby town. My panic grew with each passing mile. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. He glanced at me, a smirk forming. "Somewhere private. You'll like it." I forced myself to smile. "I'm really not sure about that." He didn't respond. Hours seemed to pass, the road stretching endlessly through the night. Then, without warning, he slammed the brakes and the SUV screeched to a halt on the side of the road. Ahead was an old, abandoned house, the windows boarded, the paint peeling. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and a rickety fence surrounded it. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped out, and for the first time, I noticed the knives strapped to his belt. My stomach dropped, and I realized I was in immediate danger. "I don't want to get out," I said firmly. He smiled, but this time it was devoid of warmth. "Oh, don't worry, you won't be here long." I tried to open my door, but it was still locked. I pounded on it, screaming, but the forest swallowed my cries. He approached the car, unlocking it calmly. I jumped out and ran, barely looking back. The uneven ground tore at my shoes and scraped my legs, but I didn't care. I ran straight into the dense woods, following the sound of a distant stream. I didn't stop until I reached the water, and even then I wasn't safe. I had no idea where I was, no phone signal, and I could hear the faint echo of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I hid behind a cluster of trees, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps paused nearby. I could hear him muttering to himself, though I couldn't make out the words. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. I could see the road in the distance, and I started moving carefully, making my way toward it. By some miracle, a truck appeared, and I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes and yelled at me to get in. I jumped in without a second thought. He asked no questions, just drove until I reached a police station in Harrisburg. I told them everything, and they took me seriously, though there was little they could do. I gave them a description, but like he had vanished. Days later, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that SUV, the knives, the cold, calculating smile. I started seeing him in random places out of the corner of my eye, though I knew it couldn't be him. The police eventually found evidence of several abandoned homes like the one I had encountered along that stretch of highway. Missing persons reports, all unsolved, all with details that matched my story. Hitchhikers who had vanished in the dead of night. I never hitchhiked again, and I never drove on that route. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone at night, I think about how easy it would be for someone like him to appear again. How a kind smile and a polite gesture could mask something far darker, something that waits for you on a deserted stretch of road when the world is asleep. I still get shivers remembering the weight of his gaze and the metallic smell in the car. I know I was lucky. Some people aren't. Years later, I heard of another hitchhiker, a girl who went missing in Pennsylvania on a late September night. The details sounded eerily familiar. Black SUV, dense forest, isolated dirt path. My stomach turned. The world hasn't changed. The predator is still out there, patient, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to trust the wrong stranger. I never thought I'd feel the pull of the road again, the desire to leave town to go anywhere, but now the fear outweighs every urge. I still think about that night, replay it, analyze every detail. I try to remember the lessons, but sometimes it haunts me. The silent acknowledgement that one wrong choice, one moment of misplaced trust could have ended my story entirely. It's been years, and I still get the occasional urge to walk along highways, my thumb out, hoping for a ride. But it's tempered by the memory of him, the black SUV, the knives, and the cold calculation in his eyes. He taught me that evil doesn't always scream. It waits quietly, hidden behind the most normal of smiles. And sometimes it's just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I can't erase that memory, no matter how much I try. It's with me when I drive at night, when I see the dark stretches of road outside the city, when I hear stories about missing hitchhikers. I know it's out there, somewhere, still waiting. And I know the luck I had that night is rare. Even now, decades later, I occasionally drive through Pennsylvania's back roads, more for the nostalgia than the necessity, and my hands grip the wheel tightly, eyes scanning every shadow. The wind whispers through the trees, and I sometimes swear I see a black SUV lurking in the distance, its headlights appearing and disappearing like ghosts. I know it's paranoia, but it's a paranoia built on a foundation of real terror. I've shared this story only with a few people over the years because most wouldn't believe it. They'd say it's just another urban legend, another scary story about hitchhiking. But I remember every detail vividly. I remember the smell in the car, the coldness in his eyes, the way the dirt path twisted unnaturally into the forest. I remember running barefoot across underbrush, my lungs burning, my heart hammering like a drum. I remember the relief of seeing a stranger in a truck, someone who could have ignored me, but didn't. Sometimes I wonder how many others weren't so lucky. I wonder about the people who vanished along the Pennsylvania backroads, their stories swallowed by the forest, erased from the world, except in the memories of those few who saw something, or someone, that they shouldn't have. I think about the predator, patient and cunning, and I shiver. Because I know that if I hadn't been lucky, if I'd hesitated even for a moment, this story wouldn't exist at all. I try to live normally, but hitchhiking is forever burned into my memory, a cautionary tale of the thin line between trust and danger. And late at night, when I drive alone along a dark stretch of highway, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow of that black SUV, the glint of knives, and the calculating smile of a man who waits quietly for those who think the world is safe. Story the end. It was just past dusk when I pulled my thumb out on the side of Highway 82, hoping for a ride that would get me back home before night swallowed everything. The sky was a bruised purple, clouds smudged like charcoal across it, and the wind carried the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I'd been hitchhiking since the afternoon, starting from a small town near the Mississippi line, trying to make my way back to my parents' place in Arkansas. I was young, 17, full of that idiotic confidence only teenagers have. The kind that convinces you the world is safe if you're careful enough. But the second car to slow down for me that evening was enough to make me question that belief entirely. It was an old, rusted Chevy, its paint chipped and faded. The tires squealed slightly as the driver eased to the shoulder. I could see a figure behind the wheel, hunched over the steering wheel, though the shadows made it impossible to tell much more. I nodded and climbed in, slipping the door shut behind me. "Evening," the man said. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping across metal. "Where you headed?" "Arkansas," I said, hoping my tone sounded casual. I didn't want to give away just how alone and unsure I felt. He hummed, eyes briefly catching mine in the rearview mirror. "Got family there?" "Yeah," I said, my hands gripping the edges of the seat. "Just trying to get home." The silence settled in after that. He didn't speak much, just drove, the engine groaning with every mile. At first, I tried to make small talk, asked about the weather, about the road, about anything, but his answers were monosyllabic, his eyes glued to the dark road ahead. After a while, the road became more desolate, lined with old farmland and patches of woods that seemed to press in from both sides. The sun had finally disappeared, leaving the world in a dim twilight. I started to feel an unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't the usual hitchhiker nerves. This was something deeper, the kind of instinct that makes your stomach tighten and your skin crawl. "Mind if I ask you something?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. I tried again, leaning slightly toward him. Do you drive this way often?" His hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. "All the time," he muttered. The ride continued in tense silence. Every few minutes, he would glance at me through the mirror, and each time it felt like he was studying me in a way that made my teeth ache. Then, without warning, he slowed the car to a crawl and pulled off onto a dirt track that branched away from the highway. "Where are we going?" I asked, voice rising despite myself. He didn't answer. I noticed then the truck bed, or trailer, whatever it was, he had attached behind the car. Something inside it shifted as we drove, a low metallic clink that made my stomach churn. I tried to stay calm, telling myself maybe it was just tools or old farm equipment, but the sound didn't match anything normal. We drove for miles, the headlights slicing weakly through the growing darkness. Every tree seemed taller here, twisted into shapes that were unnatural in the failing light. I asked again where he was taking me, and again, no answer. Finally, we stopped. There was a clearing ahead, and the man turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. He turned to me then, and the dim glow of the dashboard revealed his face, pale, almost gray, with a thin scar running down his left cheek. His eyes were dark, empty, and I realized in that instant that he hadn't blinked once during the drive. "Get out," he said softly. My mind screamed no, but my body moved on its own. I opened the door, stepping onto soft, wet dirt. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, the air thick with the smell of rotting leaves. I glanced back at the car, but he didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then I heard it, a metallic scraping like chains being dragged across the ground. My heart stopped. From the trailer, something was moving, something big. It hit the back of the trailer with a wet thud, and I realized it wasn't equipment. It was alive. I ran. My legs moved faster than I thought possible, pushing through mud and tangled underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard the man shout something. Or maybe it was a scream. The scraping continued, following me, faster and heavier than any human could move. I stumbled into a ditch and rolled, getting up as quickly as I could. The sounds were right behind me now, a wet, dragging rhythm that filled the night. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a road, my shoes soaked and my lungs burning. A pickup truck approached, headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved frantically, shouting for help. The truck slowed, and the driver rolled down the window. "You okay, kid?" he asked. I nodded, choking back tears. "Please, just drive. Please." He hesitated, but something in my eyes must have convinced him. He opened the passenger door, and I climbed in, panting. I told him as much as I could, but I couldn't explain the sounds, the eyes, the trailer. He just shook his head, muttering something about these damn kids playing tricks on themselves. We drove until we reached the next town. I thanked him, and he watched me go with a concerned frown. I never saw the rusted Chevy again. I never found out who that man was or what was in the trailer. But that night, for hours afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Every noise made my stomach twist. It was weeks before I felt safe again, and even then, the memory of that pale man and the dragging, metallic sound haunted me. I know what people will say. I was young, scared, imagining things, but I'm telling the truth. I didn't imagine the way he looked, the way he moved, the way that thing in the trailer followed me through the woods. Years later, I would read about missing hitchhikers, bodies found in remote parts of Arkansas and Mississippi, some with strange wounds, some completely drained of life, as if whatever attacked them had no interest in leaving a trace. I never knew if the people I read about were victims of the same man, or if I had been spared only by luck. But the memory of that night, the way the air seemed to thicken around me, the sound of metal scraping against metal in the dark, it never left. Sometimes, when I drive alone at night, especially on long stretches of empty highways, I remember the pale man and the trailer. I remember the silence, the way the shadows pressed close, the way my own fear felt like it could be ripped out of me. And I remember one thing more than anything else. Never get into a car with someone just because they slow down for you. Because sometimes the person who stops is not stopping to help. It's been years, but every so often I still hitchhike in my mind, thinking maybe I could have done something differently. But the truth is, there was nothing I could do once that Chevy turned off the road. There was nothing I could do when the dragging began. All I could do was run and hope I made it out. Even now, I sometimes dream of that night, the night the man stopped, the trailer rattled, and I ran through mud and shadow until I found the road. And every time I wake up with the same knot in my stomach, the same fear in my chest, and I remember, some people aren't just hitchhikers' nightmares. Some are real, and they are waiting. Story the end. It was late August when I decided to hitchhike home from college. I'd missed my bus, my car had broken down, and I didn't want to call my parents to pick me up. It was the kind of decision that, in hindsight, I would regret forever. The campus parking lot was mostly empty, the sun setting behind a line of trees casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I stood at the edge of the lot, thumb out, hoping someone would stop. I'd always thought of hitchhiking as adventurous, a test of courage, but that evening it felt reckless. The first few cars passed without slowing. Most people just looked at me, shrugged, and drove on. It wasn't until a beat-up green SUV rolled to a halt that I finally got a ride. The driver was an older man, maybe late 40s, with a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He smiled at me warmly as I slid into the passenger seat. "Where you headed, kid?" he asked. I told him the small town where my parents lived, about 50 miles away. He nodded and said, "No problem. Hop in. I'm heading that way anyway." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. I wish I'd noticed the way he didn't make eye contact when he smiled. As we merged onto the highway, the conversation was light. He asked about school. I asked about his job, which he claimed was delivery driving for a local furniture company. He offered me water from a cooler in the back, and I accepted, not thinking twice. The truck smelled faintly of pine and old leather. We were quiet for stretches, which I didn't mind. The sun dipped lower, the sky painted in streaks of pink and orange. For a while, I let myself relax, but then things started to feel off. The road signs became unfamiliar. I asked him if we were still on the highway to my town. He laughed lightly and said, "Shortcut," before veering onto a narrow 2-lane road flanked by dense woods. I started to feel uneasy. The trees pressed close on either side, their shadows stretching like dark fingers across the asphalt. I tried to convince myself that maybe he knew a faster route, but the unease only grew. And here it grew. After a while, the radio crackled and went silent. He fiddled with it, muttering under his breath before giving up. The silence was heavy, pressing against my ears. I tried to make conversation, but his answers grew shorter, less engaged. Occasionally, he would hum a strange tune under his breath, one I didn't recognize. It was slow, repetitive, and oddly discordant. I found myself watching him more than the road, noticing little things that made my stomach tighten. The way he tapped his fingers nervously on the wheel, the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than necessary, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. Eventually, he pulled off the road into a clearing where an old, run-down gas station sat under a flickering light. "Gotta check something real quick," he said, hopping out. I stayed in the car, telling myself it was normal, but when I looked at the windows, I realized they weren't quite clear. They were smudged with dirt and something darker, like old grease or grime. I couldn't see the inside clearly, but I could feel him watching me from the shadows, even when he was supposedly outside. The sense of dread hit me hard. I considered leaving right then, running into the night, but the car doors were locked. I couldn't figure out how to open them, and the keys were still in the ignition. Panic started to creep in. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I'd be okay, that people hitchhike all the time without anything happening. But the feeling that something was horribly wrong kept gnawing at me. When he came back, he was carrying a small toolkit. He muttered something about checking the brakes and stepped back into the driver's seat. The truck roared to life and we were back on the road, but now the trees were closer together, the air thicker. Every so often he would glance at me with that same half smile, and I could feel his gaze probing, assessing. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he gave monosyllabic answers, his humming returning in intervals. Each note of that strange tune seemed to tighten the knot of fear in my stomach. Time passed oddly on that road. Minutes felt like hours. The moon rose, pale and cold, illuminating a path through the dark woods. We passed a series of old, abandoned houses with windows smashed, doors hanging open. I felt a sick twist of fear at the sight, imagining what could have happened in those places. He didn't react at all, just drove past as if nothing was unusual. I realized then that I had no idea where we were. I didn't recognize any of the roads, and the GPS on my phone had no signal. My thumb hovered near the lock on the door, my mind racing for a plan. Finally, the truck slowed and turned down a dirt path that led deep into the forest. The shadows of the trees seemed alive now, stretching and twisting unnaturally. My hands were shaking. I whispered, "Are we almost there?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said softly, "You're almost home, just a little further." His voice sent a chill through me. The calmness had vanished, replaced by something darker, predatory. The dirt path ended at a small clearing. A decrepit shack stood at the edge, boards hanging loose, the roof sagging. He parked in front of it, turned off the engine, and leaned back, studying me. "You'll like it here," he said. "It's quiet, safe." I realized then that this wasn't a detour. This was the final destination. I was trapped. My heart hammered, and I began to search for a way out. But the shack was surrounded by dense woods. The sense of isolation pressed down on me like a physical weight. I tried reasoning, speaking calmly, hoping to appeal to whatever humanity he had. He smiled, that same half-smile, and shook his head. "No need to worry, kid. You're safe, for now." The words made my stomach twist with fear. He seemed to take pleasure in my discomfort, in my growing panic. I watched him get out of the truck and open the back door. I couldn't see what he was carrying at first, but as he stepped closer, I realized it was a small metal box, old and dented. He carried it like it was nothing, casual, almost affectionate. I sat frozen, trying to think. I needed to escape, but any sudden move would alert him. I remembered the small self-defense techniques I had learned, but the confined space of the truck and the proximity of the shack made them nearly useless. He approached, humming his eerie tune, and I could see his eyes glinting in the moonlight. I felt a wave of desperation. I had to run, somehow. When he stepped inside the shack, I saw my chance. I bolted from the truck, sprinting into the woods. The branches clawed at my arms and legs, the underbrush snagging my clothes. I heard him shouting behind me, his voice warped, almost animalistic. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and rocks until I stumbled onto an old logging road. Exhausted, bleeding, terrified, I waved my arms at the first car that came by. A man in a pickup truck stopped, and I collapsed into his cab, shaking and incoherent. He drove me to the nearest police station. The police were skeptical at first. Hitchhiking stories often ended in exaggeration, they said. But when they went with me to the area I had described, they found the shack. It was exactly as I had remembered. Boarded up windows, decayed walls, and the lingering sense of neglect and malevolence. There was no sign of him. No truck, no toolkit, nothing but the empty, decaying shack. I never found out who he was or if anyone else had been taken. Later, I read online forums where people described seeing a similar green SUV, older model, stopping for hitchhikers along isolated highways across Missouri, Illinois, and Kansas. The stories were vague, but the pattern was clear. A friendly stranger offering rides that ended in disappearances or terrifying encounters. The realization that he might still be out there, doing the same thing to someone else, made my skin crawl. I moved across the country shortly afterward, determined never to hitchhike again. The experience left a permanent mark. I don't trust strangers the way I used to. Every shadow, every unknown car at night brings a momentary flash of fear. The open road, which once represented freedom and adventure, now represents something darker. Vulnerability, the unpredictability of strangers, and the haunting possibility of encountering someone like him again. Even years later, driving down a lonely highway, I can't shake the memory. The way he smiled, the tune he hummed, the isolation of the shack deep in the woods, they are etched into my mind. I can't unsee it, can't forget the terror of being completely at the mercy of someone who seemed so ordinary, so harmless at first. It changed how I view the world, and it's a lesson I carry with me every time I see a hitchhiker, every time I pass a dark, empty road. The open road is not always what it seems, and some dangers hide behind the most ordinary faces. Story, the end. It was around 10 p.m. on a sweltering August night in Missouri when I realized I had made the kind of mistake that stories warn about but never feel real until they happen. I had been visiting my cousin in a small town near the Ozark Mountains, helping him with a weekend project on his uncle's property, and I'd lost track of time in the comfortable haze of country living. My plan had been to catch a bus back to Springfield, but the last one had left hours ago, leaving me stranded with a road that stretched into darkness, bordered by thick woods and fields that were just shadows under the dim glow of a full moon. I had considered walking, but quickly realized that would take hours, maybe even the whole night. So, like a fool, I stuck out my thumb at the edge of the road, hoping for a kind stranger. Most of the cars that passed were pickup trucks with dusty trailers. their occupants staring straight ahead, music blaring, ignoring me entirely. I remember gripping the strap of my backpack tighter and feeling that creeping anxiety you get when the isolation starts pressing in and the occasional distant howl of some night animal doesn't help. It was nearly an hour before a car finally slowed. A rusty blue Chevy pickup, older than me by at least a decade, pulled up and a man leaned out the window. He had a broad face, lined but not in a way that suggested age so much as hard living, and a crooked, uneven smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You need a lift?" he called, voice gravelly. I nodded quickly, relief washing over me, and climbed in. The truck smelled of cigarette smoke, leather, and some other undefinable scent that immediately made my stomach twist. The man introduced himself as Roy, kept his eyes on the road, and asked where I was headed. When I mentioned Springfield, he nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that's a ways. Buckle up, kid." The first few minutes were silent, the hum of the engine and the tires against the asphalt filling the void. I tried to make small talk, but his answers were monosyllabic, and I noticed the way his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, like he was gripping it so tightly his joints ached. Then, almost casually, he asked, "You been out here alone long?" I laughed nervously. "Couple hours, maybe. Doesn't feel that long." "You sure about that?" His eyes flicked to mine in the rearview mirror, sharp and assessing. There was an edge in his voice that made my stomach sink. I tried to shake off the unease. I've always believed in trusting my gut, but there's a curious thing that happens when you're suddenly dependent on someone. You start questioning your instincts because the alternative is hopelessly lonely darkness. The ride continued, and the woods on either side seemed to close in as we drove further away from the last town. The headlights of passing vehicles were scarce, and the moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above. I noticed something strange. The road was no longer familiar. The man had taken a turn I didn't recognize, a narrow, winding path that seemed to go deeper into the hills rather than toward the highway. "Hey," I said cautiously, "I think I missed a turn. Shouldn't we be going the other way?" Roy didn't answer. Not immediately. When he finally did, his tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an undercurrent of menace. "Nope. This way's quicker. Trust me, kid." My heart started to thump. I tried to stay calm, kept my voice level. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound suspicious. I'm not familiar with this road." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Ain't nothing to be afraid of. Don't worry, we'll get you where you need to go." Despite his words, my sense of dread sharpened. I realized that I had no idea where we were. The dark road twisted unnaturally, as if it didn't follow any logic of the main highways I knew. Trees arched over the path so closely that it felt like we were driving through a tunnel of shadows. I started scanning the rearview mirror, checking for any signs of other cars, any indication that we were still connected to civilization. But there was nothing. No headlights, no distant street lamps, just black. I made a choice then, probably a dangerous one. I tried to reach for my phone to see if I had signal. My hands shook as I pulled it from my pocket. 1 bar, not enough for a call, but maybe enough for a map. I tapped on the screen and the GPS struggled, flickering between locations, finally showing a tiny red dot surrounded by nothing. We were nowhere. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone light but firm, "I think I need to get off here. Can you pull over? I can figure out the rest from here." Roy's grip on the wheel tightened. "Why would you want to do that?" I just need to make a call," I said, trying not to let the fear crack my voice. He laughed again, that low, uneven chuckle, and I swear I could see his teeth glinting in the dim dashboard light. "You're fine. Don't worry about it. You'll get where you need to go." The truck slowed, but not enough to pull over, and then Roy made a turn onto an even narrower path, dirt kicking up from the tires. The sound of the truck seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the still night air, and I realized there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I started to think fast, frantically. I had read enough true crime stories to know that a hitchhiker in my position was in real danger. I considered asking him to stop again, but my voice would betray me. My heart was hammering so loud I was certain he could hear it. I scanned the cab for anything, keys, gear shift leverage, anything I could use, but the truck was standard, nothing improvised. Then I saw it, a glint under the seat, a small flashlight. I grabbed it, fumbled to click it on. The beam cut across the interior of the truck, and for a split second, I caught his expression. Eyes cold. Something about them wasn't human. Not entirely. My stomach turned, and I realized then that I might not live through this ride. The truck veered sharply, almost tipping, and I yelled instinctively. Roy slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a halt on the soft earth. I threw myself toward the passenger door, yanking it open. Dirt and gravel flew up as I scrambled out into the night, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice like gravel dragged across metal. I didn't stop. I ran into the woods, the flashlight cutting a path through the dense trees, branches clawing at my clothes and face. The sound of him climbing out of the truck followed me. The engine died, and then there was silence except for my ragged breathing and the distant rustling of wildlife. I ran for what felt like hours, not daring to look back until the woods finally thinned, and I stumbled onto a narrow 2-lane road. A car passed, headlights blinding me, and I waved frantically. The driver slowed and rolled down the window. "You okay? Please?" "I need help," I shouted, voice cracking. "Some guy, he tried to—" I couldn't finish the sentence, choked on the words, but the driver understood. He pulled over and let me in. As we drove back towards Springfield, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck and Roy's face. Nothing. Only darkness. I called the police as soon as I got cell signal and reported the incident. They found no traces of the truck the next day. No tire tracks, no signs of Roy. The highway patrol suggested that maybe he had turned back, maybe he had gone elsewhere, but something in my gut told me that I hadn't imagined it, that what I had seen in those headlights, that smile, was real. The worst part, though, was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that some part of him had followed me, invisible, lurking in the edges of my vision whenever I was alone, even weeks later. Sleeping became difficult. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by streetlights at night, felt like him waiting, smiling, watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just fear, just adrenaline, just the mind's way of replaying a terrifying scenario. But then I heard about another hitchhiker near the same area a week after my experience, who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. And the description of the man? Almost exactly like Roy. Same crooked smile, same gravelly voice, same old blue Chevy pickup. I stopped hitchhiking after that. Never again. I tell this story now because people need to understand that the stories about hitchhiking aren't just urban legends. They're warnings. People like Roy exist, and they roam the roads looking for the unsuspecting, the isolated, the ones who make the same mistakes I did. You think you're alone, you think you're safe, but when someone wants to hurt you, the darkness becomes their ally, and you become prey. Years later, I drove past the same stretch of road, the one that veered into the Ozarks, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of headlights reflecting in the rearview mirror. I wanted to convince myself it was another car, another traveler, but deep down, I knew better. I slowed the car instinctively, checking the side mirrors, the rear view, but there was nothing. Just the winding road, the trees pressing in like they always had, and the eerie silence. I left that road behind, but the memory never left me. I can still feel that grip on the steering wheel, the cold calculation in those eyes, the way he laughed, like he had all the time in the world, and I had none. I can still hear the crunch of gravel as I fled, the sound of my heart hammering in my ears, and the utter hopelessness of knowing that, for a moment, I was completely at his mercy. It taught me something about human vulnerability, about the thin veneer of civility that can be shattered by one encounter. Hitchhiking seems innocent, a favor, a kind act in the middle of nowhere. But the truth is, when the wrong person stops, that act can become a ticket to horror, and you never know until it's too late. I never told my family the full extent of what happened, not at first. I was ashamed, terrified, and part of me thought they wouldn't believe me. But the fear lingered. Every time I drove alone at night, every time I passed an empty road, I felt that same tightness in my chest, the same reflex to scan the shadows for someone or something that shouldn't be there. I became hyper-aware, cautious to the point of paranoia. One night, years later, I found myself driving along the outskirts of a small Missouri town again, late at night, memories of that long-ago summer pressing in. I passed a lonely stretch of road, the same kind where I had once thumbed for a ride. Reflexively, I glanced into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a familiar shape. There it was. A flicker in the darkness, a blue shape, the kind of shape you don't notice until it's too late. My hands tightened on the wheel, pulse spiking. But as I watched, it disappeared, melting into the shadows like it had never been there. I didn't stop, I didn't slow down, I didn't look back, and I never will. Hitchhiking may seem like freedom, like adventure, but the reality is, out there in the night, on roads that twist and vanish into the unknown, freedom can turn into terror faster than you can comprehend. And sometimes it's not just a story. Sometimes it's real. Story the end. It was the kind of late summer evening that felt endless, the kind where the sun hangs on just long enough to make the shadows stretch like fingers across the highway. I had just left a friend's place in western Pennsylvania, somewhere near the outskirts of a small town called Indiana. Not the state, just the town. And I was trying to make it back to Pittsburgh without spending any money. College was tight and gas wasn't cheap, so I decided the old-fashioned way, hitchhiking. I'd done it a handful of times before, always cautiously and always on busier roads where I knew someone would be driving by eventually. This night, though, the sky was a bruised orange, the clouds thick and low, and the traffic was sparse. I stood on the shoulder of Route 119, thumb extended, and felt the weight of the empty highway press down on me. The first few cars passed without slowing. I waved at a pickup truck loaded with what looked like feed sacks, but it kept going. Same with a sedan, a beat-up minivan, a motorcycle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, my optimism started to fade. I tucked my backpack closer to my body and considered walking to the next exit, but it was at least 3 miles down the road, and the thought of walking alone on a darkening highway in the middle of nowhere was less appealing than sticking it out. Finally, a vehicle appeared. A rusty old Ford van, faded blue, patched with primer, rolled up slowly beside me. The window on the driver's side cracked open. A man in his late 40s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, leaned toward me. "Need a ride?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it much in the past year. "Yeah, thanks," I said, sliding the door open. Inside, the van smelled faintly of oil and cigarette smoke, the seats worn and torn. He nodded once and eased back onto the road. I gave him the highway exit I needed, and he muttered something about taking a shortcut. I didn't mind. I was grateful just to be off my feet. The first 10 minutes were uneventful. He hummed to some old country music on the radio, tapping the wheel with one hand, while the other rested lazily on the shifter. But as the miles stretched on, I realized we weren't on the highway anymore. The pavement was cracked and narrow, lined with dense trees on either side, shadows thickening as night fell. The van bumped along, and I asked where we were. "Shortcut," he said again, but his tone was different this time, almost playful, like he was teasing. "You're gonna see some real country out here. Ain't no one on these roads at night. Perfect for a drive, right?" Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I glanced at him, but he was staring straight ahead, expression unreadable under the dim dash lights. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about his hometown, his work, anything, but he answered in vague monosyllables, and soon the music faded out, leaving only the rumble of the van over uneven pavement and the sound of the wind through the cracked windows. After maybe 20 more minutes, I started to notice signs of neglect. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows longer. Every so often we passed an old, abandoned farmhouse, the paint peeling, windows dark. I couldn't see any movement, but the emptiness was uncanny, like the buildings were frozen in time. My chest began to tighten. I tried to gauge where we were, looking at road signs, but they were old and weather-beaten, and sometimes they were missing entirely. The more I looked, the more it felt like we were moving farther and farther from civilization. "Hey," I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. Can you get me back to the highway?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he gave a low chuckle. "Highway? Nah, we'll get there. But first, you gotta see something. Something real." My stomach dropped. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but my words stuck in my throat. The van slowed to a crawl, and I noticed a narrow dirt path veering off from the main road. He turned down it. My heart pounded, and I started to get up, but the van hit a bump, and I flop-bopped back against the seat. The path was overgrown, trees arching overhead like they were closing in. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he had lived out here a long time. Maybe he knew some secret road shortcuts. Maybe he was harmless. But a small voice in the back of my head screamed otherwise. After what felt like forever, the path opened into a small clearing. In the middle was a decayed structure, a shack of some kind, leaning heavily to one side. The boards were warped, the roof sagging, and the whole thing emitted a strange, musty smell that hit me the moment we stopped. "Here it is," he said, shutting off the engine. Silence settled, heavier than the dark itself. I froze. "Here? What?" "Just come take a look," he said, smiling faintly, like he was sharing a private joke. I don't think I should," I started, but before I could finish, he was already opening the passenger door. I hesitated, hand on the frame, but some instinct told me I had to get out. I had to see what was going on, if only to gauge how dangerous he was. I stepped onto the dirt, the ground soft and damp, and the air was colder here, musty with rot. He led me closer to the shack. The closer I got, the more I noticed the smell, metallic, iron-like, mingled with something fouler. My stomach churned. The boards of the shack had gaps, and through them I could see shapes, but they weren't quite clear. I wanted to run, but I also needed to understand. I leaned closer to peek inside, and my stomach dropped. The shack was filled with cages. Small ones, large ones. Some hung from hooks, some sat on the floor. And inside, something moved. Human-shaped shadows, pale, thin, unmoving. At first, I thought they were mannequins, props left in the abandoned shack. But then I saw the faintest twitch, a finger, a flicker of hair. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Those are people." The man behind me chuckled low and deep. "Yup, lost, wandering folks mostly. They end up here. Don't usually last long. You, though, you could be special." I stumbled backward. I'm leaving. Now. I don't care about the highway or your shortcut. I'm leaving." He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you are. But first." He lunged. I screamed and ran. My backpack hit the dirt with a thud, and I scrambled over roots and rocks, trying to get back to the van. The engine was off, doors wide open, like a trap. I grabbed the handle, yanked, and it didn't budge. Panic surged. I ran into the darkness, hoping to find the road, any road. Branches scratched my arms, my clothes snagged. I heard him behind me, laughing, a sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't look back, just ran. And then I saw it. A faint glow ahead. The dull shine of asphalt reflecting the last of the sun. I sprinted toward it, tearing my feet over roots and stones, and finally hit the pavement. I collapsed there, gasping, my body shaking from adrenaline and fear. A car appeared in the distance. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like a madman. The car slowed, a young couple inside staring at me like I'd grown a second head. I pointed behind me. "Please, someone. They didn't see anyone." The road behind me was empty. No van, no man, nothing. Just dark trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't explain it, and I never told anyone I hitched that night. I just got into the car, begged for a ride to the nearest town, and stayed in a motel for the night, refusing to leave until morning. When I finally made it back to Pittsburgh, I tried to report the shack, the van, the man. But Route 119 is dotted with back roads, abandoned houses, and old farm tracks. Police told me there was no record of any van matching that description in the area, no missing person reports tied to the coordinates I could give, and no abandoned shack with cages, at least according to property records. I couldn't shake the memory. The smell, the cages, the pale shapes. Sometimes I dream about the shack, see it in flashes when I close my eyes, and I wake up panting, convinced I hear the slow creak of boards in the dark. I've never hitchhiked again. Years later, I read about a series of disappearances in rural western Pennsylvania, travelers vanishing along small highways. Nothing ever proved a connection, just scattered reports and theories. But I knew the truth, at least in part. Some people hide in plain sight, using roads like mine, vans like his, and the darkest corners of the countryside to trap the unwary. And sometimes you get lucky and run. Other times, you don't. I still drive Route 119 when I visit family, but I never stop for hitchhikers. And I never look over my shoulder at the trees. Because somewhere out there, the roads are long, dark, and quiet, and not everyone who smiles at you from a van wants to help. Even now, years later, if I drive late at night, I sometimes see a van in the distance, rusted and faded, moving slowly, and my thumb twitches on instinct. But I don't stop. I never will. Because some rides end differently. Story the end. It was a late September evening when I found myself on the side of Route 61 in Mississippi, thumb out, hoping for a ride. I had just left a friend's house in a small town outside of Jackson, a visit that had been too short and the last bus had already left for the city. I was 22, inexperienced, and far too trusting of strangers, but I thought nothing of it at the time. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by thick forest that smelled damp and earthy from the evening dew. The air was cool, but the chill seemed to seep through my jacket and into my bones. Cars passed in streaks of headlights, none of them slowing. I tried to remember all the warnings about hitchhiking, all the true horror stories I'd heard in passing. I'd told myself they were exaggerated, that danger was something that happened to other people. I stuck my thumb out, and for almost an hour, nothing. My stomach grumbled, and I shifted from foot to foot, scanning the horizon, praying someone would stop. Finally, headlights approached, bright and steady, and a red Ford F-150 pickup slowed. The driver was a man who looked to be in his late 40s, balding with a salt and pepper beard, wearing a flannel shirt. He leaned across the console to open the passenger door. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice low, calm, but with a strange edge. I nodded quickly and slid in, grateful for the warmth of the cab. "You headed into Jackson?" he asked. "Yeah, that's right," I said, my voice a little shaky. The warmth of relief had barely registered before the first hint of unease hit me. His eyes were too sharp, too calculating. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a depth that felt invasive. "Name's Frank," he said, reaching across to adjust the mirror so he could see me. "You by yourself?" I nodded, suddenly feeling the isolation of the long stretch of road pressing in on me. "Yeah, just visiting a friend," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. The first few miles were uneventful, filled with the hum of the engine and the occasional radio static. But as we drove further from the town, the atmosphere shifted. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees, shadows stretching long in the beams of the headlights. I tried to map the route in my mind, realizing we weren't on the highway I expected. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "I think you might have missed a turn. I should be closer to the main road." He didn't answer right away. I glanced at him and noticed the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel. When he finally spoke, it was calm, unnervingly calm. "Nope. This way's better. Trust me." My stomach sank. I wanted to protest, but the words lodged in my throat. Something about the dead silence outside, the way the woods seemed to lean in, made me doubt my instincts. I forced a smile and tried small talk, but his responses were clipped, almost dismissive. The only thing constant was that unwavering look in his eyes. We passed a curve, then another, the road twisting unnaturally. I realized I had no idea where we were. I reached for my phone to check GPS, my hands trembling. 1 bar, not enough to call for help, and the map flickered, showing only a small dot surrounded by nothing. Frank, I really think I need to get out here. I should be able to call a ride from here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You sure about that, kid?" "Yes. I just need to figure out the rest from here," I said, swallowing my fear. "You're fine," he said, leaning back, though the tight grip on the steering wheel betrayed his composure. "No need to worry." The road grew narrower, the forest pressing even closer. I realized there was no shoulder, no safe place to stop. Panic bubbled in my chest. I tried to think, to come up with a plan, but the isolation made it hard to focus. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a glint under the seat. A flashlight. I reached for it silently, praying he wouldn't notice, and flicked it on. The beam illuminated his face for just a second. There was something there. Something not quite human, not in a way I could describe. My pulse surged. Without thinking, I yanked the passenger door open and bolted into the woods. Branches tore at my jacket and hair as I ran blindly, adrenaline pushing me forward. Behind me, I heard the truck engine start, then stop, then the crunch of gravel as he gave chase. I didn't look back, fearing that if I did, I might see something that would haunt me forever. I ran until the trees thinned, and I stumbled onto a dirt road. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept moving. I waved my arms desperately when a car approached. The driver slowed, and I jumped in without hesitation. "Please, you have to help me," I gasped. Someone's after me." The driver didn't ask questions, just drove. I dialed 911 as soon as I had cell signal and gave my location. When the police arrived at the area I had described, there was no truck, no sign of Frank, nothing. They suggested it might have been a hallucination, stress, or an exaggeration, but I knew what I saw. I knew the fear was real. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow, every unfamiliar sound reminded me of that night. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, avoiding isolated roads, avoiding strangers entirely. Then, a week later, a local news report caught my attention. Another hitchhiker had gone missing on the same stretch of road. Witnesses described the driver as a middle-aged man with a blue or red pickup, salt and pepper beard, and a crooked smile. My stomach dropped. It had to be him. I stopped hitchhiking entirely. The lesson had burned itself into me. Roads that seem empty and harmless are not always safe. Strangers may offer kindness, but sometimes that kindness hides something much darker. I carried the memory with me everywhere, the sense of vulnerability never far away, a reminder that the world can be far more dangerous than we allow ourselves to believe. Years later, I drove past that stretch of road again. Night had fallen, the moon hung low, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the asphalt. For a brief moment, I thought I saw headlights in my rearview mirror, a flicker of red and blue. My heart raced. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. Some lessons are meant to be remembered. Some horrors meant never to be confronted again. Hitchhiking may seem innocent, even adventurous, but out there on roads lost to darkness, what seems like freedom can turn into fear in a heartbeat. And sometimes the horror isn't in the imagination, it's real. The memory of that night has stayed with me, etched into my mind, a constant reminder of human vulnerability. Even now, when I drive alone after dark, I instinctively check the mirrors, scanning for movement that shouldn't be there. The fear never fully fades because it's impossible to forget the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone or something was waiting in the dark for you. The world of hitchhiking is a paradox, freedom laced with risk, generosity mixed with potential danger. That night taught me to respect the unknown, to trust my instincts, and to never ever assume safety when the road stretches empty and dark before you. I tell this story not to frighten, but to warn. Some acts of trust, some moments of vulnerability can put you directly in the path of someone who is the opposite of kind, and once that happens, the memory and the terror never leaves. Even now, I can recall the low rumble of the truck, the way Frank's eyes caught the dim light of the dashboard, the way he laughed without smiling. I can feel the panic that gripped me as I ran into the trees, branches cutting into my skin, heart pounding, knowing that I had very little chance of escape. And yet, I ran. I survived. But the memory never left. It was more than fear. It was a lesson in human darkness, in the fact that some people are capable of unspeakable things, and that danger often comes masked in normalcy. You think a friendly driver is just offering help. You think the night is empty and safe. But when the wrong person decides to make you their prey, the rules of the world change, and survival becomes a matter of instinct, luck, and sheer will. I will never thumb a ride again. I will never ignore the instincts that scream when something is wrong, and I will never forget the red Ford F-150, the salt and pepper beard, and the crooked smile of a man whose intentions were anything but kind. Even as I moved to another state, changed cities, and tried to build a normal life, that night haunted me. Shadows seemed to linger in corners, headlights seemed to flicker with meaning, and the fear I had felt replayed itself in my dreams. It became a part of me, a reminder that some encounters leave permanent marks, scars that aren't visible but are felt in every choice, every glance, every isolated road. Years later, I heard of another disappearance in Mississippi, along the same stretch of road. The description matched, almost exactly, the man I had encountered. And in my chest, the same panic rose, the same cold dread, because I knew, without a doubt, that the world still held him. The danger was still out there, waiting, and the lesson remained. Trust strangers at your peril and never ever underestimate the darkness that can hide behind an ordinary face. Story the end. It was a late October evening when I decided to hitchhike back home from a friend's party in rural Ohio. I had been drinking lightly, enough that I didn't trust myself to drive, and I had missed the last bus. The sky was a bruised mix of purple and gray, and the chill in the air made me regret leaving my jacket behind. I found a relatively flat stretch of highway that stretched for miles, surrounded by dense woods on either side, and stuck my thumb out, hoping for a ride before darkness fully descended. The cars passing me were few, and even fewer slowed. Most just passed with indifferent glances, and I started to feel the creeping isolation of being alone on an empty road. After about 20 minutes, a beat-up green minivan slowed and pulled over. The windows were streaked with grime, but I could see the driver, a man who looked to be in his late 40s, thin, with a pale face and restless eyes. "Hey there, need a lift?" he asked. His voice was oddly flat, neither welcoming nor threatening, but the emptiness behind his eyes unsettled me immediately. "Yeah, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to get back to Akron." He nodded and gestured to the passenger seat. I slid in, noticing that the interior smelled faintly of mold and something metallic I couldn't quite place. The engine roared to life and the van creaked down the road. We started with small talk, my plans, his work, the weather. But soon the conversation drifted into territory that made me uncomfortable. "So, you hitchhike often?" he asked, his eyes briefly meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Not really," I said cautiously. "Just tonight, I had no other option." He nodded slowly and then, without warning, said, "I always pick hitchhikers who need me." I forced a laugh, though my chest tightened. "That's thoughtful, I guess." He didn't answer, and the van rolled along in silence. The air felt heavy, and every bump in the road made me flinch. After a while, I noticed we weren't on any road I recognized. The signs were old, weathered, and the place seemed almost abandoned. My gut twisted, warning me that something was wrong. Are we on the main highway?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced at me, eyes cold and unreadable. "Shortcut," he said. "Trust me." The road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side, casting long shadows under the dimming sky. I could feel my heart start to race, and I realized I couldn't tell where we were at all. He drove in near silence, the only sound the crunch of tires on the rough pavement. Every instinct screamed at me that I should get out, but the van was moving too fast for me to react safely, and there was nowhere to escape. Then he turned onto a dirt path. It was barely wide enough for the van, twisting into the dense forest like a snake. My stomach dropped. I could see no lights ahead, no sign of civilization. "Where are we going exactly?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the road. "Just a little detour. You'll like it." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm, but the forest pressed in closer with every turn. The van hit a large pothole, bouncing violently. I gripped the seat, realizing with a sinking feeling that I was completely at his mercy. Minutes later, he stopped the van abruptly. I jerked forward. He stepped out, and I got my first real look at him in the fading light. He wasn't smiling, though before he had tried. His face was tight, almost hungry, and there was something dangerous in his posture. "I'll be right back," he said. "Wait here." I froze. My throat went dry. The door was locked, and my phone had no signal. I thought about running into the trees, but I had no sense of direction and no idea where safety could be. I could hear the crunch of leaves under his boots as he disappeared into the forest. Then came the sound of snapping branches, closer than I expected. My heart nearly stopped. I pressed my back against the seat, trying to make myself small. The footsteps circled, deliberate, slow, like he was enjoying my fear. I could hear him muttering, though I couldn't understand the words. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, none of them good. After what felt like hours, though was likely only minutes, he returned to the van. The air around him seemed heavier somehow. He climbed in silently, and the van lurched forward again, deeper into the woods. My stomach churned with fear. We drove for what felt like eternity, the sun fully set, leaving the world around us cloaked in darkness. I tried to stay calm, pretending to look out the window while silently calculating ways to escape. I noticed small details, the way he kept checking the rearview mirror, the knives strapped to his belt, the faint metallic scent that had grown stronger in the enclosed space. I realized then I had stumbled into a trap carefully planned, and that realization made my blood run cold. Eventually, the dirt path merged with a narrow paved road. I recognized some landmarks vaguely, but it was still miles from anywhere familiar. Then, without warning, he stopped again, this time in front of an old abandoned farmhouse. The windows were boarded, the yard overgrown, the fence broken in places. My stomach dropped. What? What is this place? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He stepped out, and the dim light of the van's headlights revealed more clearly the knives strapped to his belt and the faint traces of dried mud on his boots, like he had been waiting for someone, or something, for a long time. I don't want to get out, I said firmly, my voice louder now. He smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. You're already here, he said. Might as well come in. Panic surged through me. I threw myself against the door, pounding on it, screaming for help. The forest swallowed my cries. He opened the passenger door slowly, stepping toward me. I realized I couldn't fight him. My only chance was to run. I bolted into the woods without looking back, adrenaline fueling my sprint. The underbrush tore at my clothes, while branches whipped my face and arms, but I didn't care. Every sound behind me, footsteps, snapping twigs, the soft grunt of his breathing made my pulse pound faster. Hours seemed to pass. I ran blindly, eventually finding a narrow creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. Exhausted, my legs burning, I emerged onto a secondary road. I stumbled in the moonlight until a lone truck appeared, headlights cutting through the night. I ran into the road, waving frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, asking if I was okay. I told him everything, barely able to catch my breath. He drove me straight to a police station. They took my statements seriously, but told me there was little they could do. The descriptions I gave matched several missing person reports in the surrounding counties. Hitchhikers, travelers, people who had disappeared along remote stretches of road. My case was added to the list, but the man was never found. The weeks following were a blur. I couldn't sleep. I started checking over my shoulder constantly, even during the day. I drove everywhere alone, never leaving my house at night. The police investigated, but there was no trace of him or the abandoned house. Friends and family tried to reassure me, but the fear lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Years later, I heard of another hitchhiker in Ohio disappearing under eerily similar circumstances. The details matched mine, a black SUV, or in that case, a dark minivan, remote roads, forested shortcuts, and an abandoned house. I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized he was still out there, somewhere, patiently waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I had made. I've never hitchhiked again. I don't walk alone at night in rural areas. Every time I drive, I grip the wheel tighter on stretches of road where the forest leans in close. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see his cold, empty smile, the glint of knives strapped to his belt, and the darkness of that abandoned farmhouse. I can still feel the metallic scent that clung to the van's interior, and I can still hear the crunch of his boots in the leaves. I've shared this story only with a few people. Most wouldn't believe it, thinking it's an urban legend, a cautionary tale exaggerated over time. But I remember every detail vividly. I remember running barefoot through the forest, the fear so intense it burned my lungs and muscles. I remember the van, the knives, the twisted path, and the cold, patient eyes of a man who hunts the night. Even decades later, I avoid stretches of road that wind through forests after dark. I keep my doors locked when driving alone, my eyes scanning shadows along the roadside. I know the predator is out there somewhere, waiting for someone careless enough to trust him. The luck I had that night is rare, and it's a memory that haunts me endlessly. Hitchhiking taught me a brutal lesson about trust and danger, about how quickly an ordinary road can turn into a nightmare. And late at night, when the world sleeps, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black minivan silently following me, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to make the mistake I once made. Story, the end. It was a chilly mid-October evening when I found myself hitchhiking along Route 29 in rural Virginia. I had been visiting a friend in Charlottesville, and my car had broken down a few miles outside of town. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a dim shade of deep purple, the last remnants of daylight fading into the dark of night. I had no other way to get home. My phone's battery was almost dead, and there were no buses or cabs in sight. Standing on the side of the road, I stuck my thumb out, hoping that someone heading my way would offer a lift. The first few cars passed by without even a glance. Each time one went by, my stomach sank a little further. The road was mostly empty, the occasional headlights flickering in the distance, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. It felt as though the trees lining the highway were closing in on me, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me like hands. After almost 40 minutes, I started to wonder if I had made a huge mistake. But then a beat-up brown Ford pickup truck slowed and pulled over a few feet ahead. I walked toward it cautiously, trying not to appear desperate. The window rolled down, revealing a man who looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. His face was weathered, with deep lines etched into his skins, and his eyes were a pale gray that seemed to reflect more shadow than light. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Yes, please get to Charlottesville," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hop in," he said, patting the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of cigarettes and something metallic, a scent I couldn't quite place. I climbed in, and the engine growled to life, vibrating through my seat. At first, the conversation was casual: weather, road conditions, the occasional small talk about the surrounding area. But after a few minutes, I noticed he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, a lingering, calculating look that made my stomach tighten. "You hitchhike often?" he asked finally, breaking the uneasy silence. "Not really," I admitted. "Just tonight, I had no other choice." He nodded slowly, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the headlights illuminating only a small corridor of asphalt before us. Eventually, he spoke again. "You ever think about how easy it is for people to vanish out here?" I swallowed hard. I guess it's a possibility," I said, trying to sound casual despite the growing unease in my chest. He didn't answer immediately, just kept driving. The truck began veering off the main road onto a narrower, less familiar path. My gut twisted into knots. Is this the way to Charlottesville?" I asked, trying to sound unconcerned. He glanced at me, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Shortcut," he said, as though that explained everything. The road narrowed further, the trees pressing in on both sides, branches scraping against the metal of the truck. The shadows inside the cab seemed to grow longer, darker. I realized I had no idea where we were, and my stomach dropped. My heart began to pound, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Minutes passed, and I noticed we were on a dirt path, uneven and winding through the dense forest. The headlights barely illuminated the ground ahead. My anxiety escalated. "I'm not sure about this," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Maybe we should turn back?" He didn't respond. He drove in silence, taking the turns confidently, almost as if he had done this many times before. My mind raced. I considered jumping out while the truck was moving slowly over the rough dirt, but I couldn't tell which way would lead to safety. The air in the truck grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I could smell that metallic scent again, stronger now, mingled with the faint aroma of damp earth. After what felt like an eternity, he suddenly stopped the truck. I jolted forward, my hands gripping the edge of the seat. He climbed out and walked to the back, opening the truck bed for a moment before returning to the cab. "Just a little stop," he said casually, his voice unnervingly calm. "Stretch my legs." I didn't move, staring at him with wide eyes. I think I'm going to wait here," I said, my voice shaking. He smiled, though it wasn't friendly, and shrugged. "Suit yourself." He walked away into the darkness, leaving me alone in the cab. I sat frozen, heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to get out and run. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves behind the truck, and then a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. My skin crawled, and I realized with horror that I might have made a grave mistake. I pressed myself into the seat, trying to make myself invisible. The growl ceased, replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling the truck. I could hear him muttering under his breath, words I couldn't understand. My mind spun with scenarios, each one worse than the last. I thought about my family, my friends, wondering if I would ever see them again. Finally, he returned to the truck. The door opened, and he slid in beside me without a word. The metallic scent was overpowering now, and I realized he was carrying something concealed under his jacket. My stomach sank further, terror rooting me to my seat. We drove on, deeper into the woods. The dirt path twisted unnaturally, as though designed to disorient anyone unfamiliar with it. I kept glancing at him, trying to gauge his intentions, but his face was unreadable. He occasionally checked the rearview mirror, and I noticed a glint of something, perhaps metal, perhaps something worse, reflected in the dim light. Eventually, the path merged with a narrow paved road. Relief surged briefly, but it was fleeting. Up ahead, I could see the outline of a dilapidated house, its windows boarded, the paint peeling and rotting away. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and a broken fence leaned at odd angles. My heart dropped to my stomach. He slowed the truck and parked in front of the house. "Here we are," he said simply. I shook my head, my voice barely audible. I don't want to go in." He smiled again, that same cold, empty smile. "You don't have to, but I think you'll like it." Panic consumed me. I realized there was no escape, no signal on my phone, no other cars in sight, and the dense forest all around. I scrambled to open the truck door, but it was locked. I pounded on it, yelling for help, my voice echoing into the darkness. He stepped out, moving toward the passenger side. I backed away instinctively, then ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I sprinted blindly into the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but adrenaline carried me forward. I could hear his boots behind me, crunching over leaves and twigs with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. I realized he was toying with me, enjoying the chase. Hours seemed to pass. I stumbled through the underbrush, like eventually finding a creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or some sign of civilization. Exhausted, soaked, and trembling, I finally emerged onto a secondary road. The first headlights I saw were from a truck driving slowly toward me. I ran into the road, waving frantically. The driver stopped, and I nearly collapsed into the cab. Between sobs and gasps for air, I told him everything. He listened, pale and silent, then drove me straight to the nearest police station. The officers took my statements seriously, but there was little they could do. The man, the truck, the abandoned house, everything was gone. No trace remained, and no reports of missing persons in the immediate area had been recorded, though I knew from later research that others had vanished along the same stretch of road over the years. In the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in my apartment, every shadow outside my window, triggered memories of that night. The growl in the forest, the metallic smell in the truck, the cold calculation in his eyes. I stopped going out alone, avoided roads that cut through wooded areas, and developed an almost obsessive awareness of my surroundings. Years later, I heard news of another hitchhiker disappearing along a rural road in Virginia under eerily similar circumstances. The details, vehicle description, forested path, abandoned house, matched my experience almost exactly. I shivered, realizing that the predator was still out there, patient, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to make the same mistake I had. Even now, decades later, I drive cautiously along dark rural roads, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I glance in my rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting to see the shadow of a brown pickup or a pale, calculating face watching me from the distance. The memory of that night is ingrained in me, a permanent warning that the world is not always safe and that sometimes a seemingly ordinary ride can become a nightmare. Hitchhiking taught me a brutal lesson about trust, caution, and the thin line between life and death. Late at night, when the world sleeps and the roads are empty, I can still feel the weight of that man's gaze, the growl of the forest, and the suffocating metallic scent of his truck. I know he's still out there somewhere waiting, and I know how lucky I was to escape. The memory haunts me every time I see someone standing alone on the side of a rural road, thumb extended, unaware of the danger that could be waiting just a few miles down the highway. Story the end. It was a humid summer evening in Missouri when I first decided to hitchhike home. I was 19, broke and naive, convinced that the world was still safe if you just smiled at strangers. My parents had warned me against it countless times, but I'd grown up on stories of freedom, adventure, and the open road. I left the university campus with nothing but a backpack, my wallet with barely $20, and a worn-out thumb ready to flag down passing cars. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, and the highway ahead seemed endless, twisting into the thickening darkness. The first hour was uneventful, with cars whizzing past without so much as a glance. I began to feel uneasy but kept my thumb up, hoping for someone decent to stop. That's when a dusty black pickup truck slowed down, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. The driver, A middle-aged man with thinning hair and sunglasses that reflected the setting sun waved me over. He had a kind of quiet charm that made me lower my guard immediately. I climbed in, grateful to be out of the sweltering heat. He introduced himself as Ray, and his voice was deep, calm, and oddly soothing. "Where are you headed?" he asked without a hint of hurry. I told him my town, about 40 miles away, and he nodded, adjusting the rearview mirror. His truck smelled faintly of smoke and pine, an odd combination that somehow made me feel at ease. We started chatting about mundane things, the weather, my classes, his work as a trucker making regional deliveries. It was easy to talk to him, and for a moment the unease that had gnawed at me vanished. But as the miles ticked by, I started noticing little things. The highway was getting narrower, more desolate. Streetlights became sparse, and the occasional billboard seemed older, more rusted than anything I remembered from the map I had studied. The truck's radio crackled with static, interspersed with occasional faint voices or music that didn't quite fit. Ray didn't seem to notice or didn't care. I mentioned it, half joking, and he laughed, a low, throaty sound. "Old equipment, kid. Nothing to worry about." That should have been the first red flag. About 20 minutes later, he took an exit I didn't recognize. The roads turned into dark, winding paths through dense forest. My heart started pounding when I realized we weren't going toward my town anymore. I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual, this doesn't look like the highway to Jefferson City." He gave me a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Relax, kid. Shortcut. You'll get there faster." I tried to trust him, rationalizing that maybe he knew some back roads I didn't. But the road soon became narrower still, gravel giving way to dirt, and the trees closed in so tightly that moonlight barely filtered through. An eerie quiet settled, broken only by the truck's engine and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I glanced at Ray. He was humming a tune softly, but it was off. Some old folk song I didn't recognize, the lyrics twisting into something I couldn't quite catch. There was an edge to it, something faintly threatening. I started thinking of ways to get out, but the doors were locked. Every instinct screamed at me that I was in danger. I remembered the self-defense class I'd taken months ago and tried to plan an escape, but the truck's cab was cramped and Ray was stronger than me, his hands gripping the wheel confidently. I tried conversation, asking questions, anything to stay calm and human. He responded with cryptic, sometimes jovial answers, never directly acknowledging my growing concern. The truck stopped abruptly in a clearing. A single flickering lamppost cast long, warped shadows across the dirt road. I could see a small shack at the edge of the clearing, windows boarded up, a sense of decay clinging to it. Ray stepped out first, leaving the door unlocked, but leaving me no choice but to follow. My legs felt heavy, but I obeyed out of fear, my backpack dragging behind me. Inside, the shack smelled of mildew and rusted metal. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a single table in the center, with some cans of food scattered haphazardly. On the wall hung a collection of photographs, family snapshots, but each one had faces scratched out with black ink. I felt my stomach churn, a cold sweat running down my back. Ray noticed me staring and chuckled. "You look nervous, kid. Don't be. You're safe here, for now." His tone made my blood run cold, the casualness masking something sinister. I tried to backtrack, to ask questions, but he waved a hand, cutting me off. "Sit down, relax. I like talking to people. Makes the night pass." I realized then that he wasn't going to take me anywhere. The idea of returning home had vanished. I was trapped. I tried to reason with him, to appeal to some sense of decency. Nothing worked. The way he smiled while describing trivial things, the weather, his favorite truck routes, was distorted by the knowledge that he had complete control over me. Hours passed. Ray kept up a strange mix of chatter and silence, sometimes humming the same eerie tune. I watched the night shift slowly stretch outside the shack's grimy windows, the shadows of trees moving with an almost sentient quality. He seemed almost oblivious to the growing tension, as if he thrived on it. Every time I considered making a break for it, he would glance at me and a shiver would run down my spine. He knew I was thinking about it, knew every escape route I considered. I started noticing more details, small things that shouldn't have been there. Shovels leaning in a corner, a rusted set of handcuffs hanging from a hook, and old, dusty jars filled with strange liquids. My rational mind screamed that this was a place of danger, but my fear paralyzed me. Every time I voiced concern, he would laugh softly, that same low chuckle, and it felt like it crawled under my skin. By the time the night had fully taken over, I realized I had to act fast. I remembered Ray's routine. He seemed to have moments when he got up to tend to something in the shack, leaving me with a window of opportunity. I watched his movements closely, noting the timing and direction of his steps. I waited for the perfect moment. When he left to fetch something from outside, I bolted for the door, adrenaline surging, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might explode. I ran into the darkness of the forest, the sound of my boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. Behind me, I heard Ray shout, his voice rising in a pitch that was unnatural, almost inhuman. He was faster than I anticipated, and I stumbled, scraping my hands and knees on the rough earth. But I kept moving, diving into a thick underbrush, hoping the shadows and foliage would conceal me. Hours passed as I ran, disoriented and terrified. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest seemed endless. I tripped, fell, and forced myself up, refusing to stop, knowing that stopping meant certain capture. I eventually stumbled onto a rural road just as dawn began to break. Exhausted, bleeding, and scared out of my mind, I flagged down the first car I saw. A kind couple in a station wagon stopped, and I collapsed into their car and crying and explaining as best I could between sobs. They took me to the nearest police station. The authorities were skeptical at first. Hitchhiking horror stories weren't exactly newsworthy, they said, and there were no immediate leads on Ray or the shack. But when they went to search the area I described, they found the shack exactly as I had said. Boarded up windows, decayed furniture, and the photographs, all scratched out. No sign of Ray, just the lingering smell of smoke and mildew. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving only the horror he had imposed on me behind. I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every car that passed too slowly, every shadow at the edge of my vision, sent me into a panic. I moved towns shortly after, leaving Missouri entirely, refusing to take chances on the open road again. I tried to rationalize what had happened, telling myself that it was an isolated incident, that I had been lucky. But deep down, I knew there were people like Ray out there, watching, waiting for the unsuspecting, the naive, the trusting. Years later, I learned through online forums that others had reported seeing a black pickup truck, similar in make and appearance, stopping for hitchhikers along back roads across several Midwestern states. Details varied, but the descriptions of the drivers were eerily similar. Friendly at first, almost disarmingly so, only to lead to disappearing hitchhikers or abandoned, desolate locations. The thought that Ray may have continued his pattern for years, leaving terror in his wake, haunted me. I never wanted to find out the full story, never wanted to know the worst of it. Even now, I can't drive past a lonely road without thinking of him. I've grown wary of strangers, of kindness from unknown sources, and of the deceptive freedom of the open road. Hitchhiking, once a symbol of adventure, became a symbol of vulnerability. The memory of that night, the truck, the shack, and Ray's chilling calmness stays with me, a shadow that never fully leaves. The open road may look inviting, but for me it will always hold a lingering, unspoken danger that I narrowly escaped. Story the end. It was late October when I decided to hitchhike from a small town in West Virginia to visit my cousin in Ohio. I had done a fair bit of traveling before, and I thought nothing of sticking my thumb out on a crisp autumn morning along Route 50. The sky was overcast, and the leaves had turned shades of red and orange, falling lazily to the ground with each gust of wind. I wore a hoodie and carried a small backpack with a few essentials, a change of clothes, some snacks, and a bottle of water. My parents had warned me about hitchhiking, but at 21, I felt invincible, confident that I could read people well enough to avoid trouble. I had been walking for about an hour when a beat-up Ford pickup truck slowed down beside me. The driver was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He wore a flannel shirt and had a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The window rolled down with a creak, and he asked me where I was headed. I told him I was going to Columbus, Ohio. He nodded and told me he could take me part of the way, all the way up to the Ohio border if I wanted. Something about him seemed off, but I shrugged it off, telling myself that he seemed harmless enough. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I noticed that the truck smelled faintly of smoke, and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic. The interior was cluttered with fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, and a few tools scattered on the floor. I buckled my seatbelt, and he started driving. At first, the conversation was casual. He asked me about school, work, and my family. I gave him basic answers, not wanting to reveal too much. But then the questions became more personal. Where I lived, whether I traveled alone often, and if my parents knew I was hitchhiking. I laughed nervously, telling him that my parents were fine with it, though that wasn't entirely true. The roads stretched out for miles, flanked by dense forests. The overcast sky made everything look gray and muted, and I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. The man's tone had shifted subtly. His questions weren't just about me. They seemed probing, like he was trying to map out every detail of my life. I glanced out the window, hoping for another car to pass, but the road was empty except for us. After another 20 minutes, he asked me if I wanted to stop somewhere for a break. I hesitated. My gut told me that getting out of the truck with him was a bad idea, but I didn't want to seem rude or scared. He noticed my hesitation and chuckled. "Don't worry, kid. Just a quick stop. I'm not going to hurt you." There was something in his smile that didn't match the words. I nodded, trying to sound casual, and we pulled into a small, abandoned gas station. The place was eerie, with broken windows and weeds growing through the cracks in the asphalt. He stepped out and opened my door, gesturing for me to come along. I stepped out reluctantly, feeling the chill in the air. As I stretched my legs, he wandered around the gas station, muttering to himself. I wandered a few feet away, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind the building. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart rate spiked. The man called me over, saying he found a tool he needed to fix something on the truck. I hesitated, then walked toward him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled again, that same forced, unsettling grin. "Yeah, just need to fix a little problem with the brakes," he said. "Don't worry, it won't take long." I didn't want to stay, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave my backpack in his truck and walk away. There were no other cars in sight. While he was under the hood, I tried to open my backpack, thinking maybe I could grab my phone and call someone. But my phone was dead. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had forgotten to charge it overnight. Panic bubbled up in my chest. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned to me, noticing my agitation. "Everything all right, kid?" I forced a smile. Yeah, just stretching my legs. He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing for a brief second before returning to that unsettling, calm demeanor. We got back into the truck, and the ride continued in silence. My hands gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white. Every mile that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. Eventually, we reached a stretch of road that cut through dense forest. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, leaving a cold, gray light. The man slowed the truck and said, "I know a shortcut through the woods. Trust me, it'll get us there faster." My stomach dropped. I forced a polite smile, shaking my head. "I think I'll stay on the main road, thanks." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "Come on, kid. It's safe. You'll see." I didn't respond, keeping my eyes on the road. The tension in the truck was thick enough to cut with a knife. He finally relented and stayed on the main road, but the atmosphere had shifted. He was quiet, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and watchful. Every sound, the hum of the engine, the crunch of leaves under the tires, the occasional caw of a crow made me jump. The road seemed endless, winding through the woods with no sign of civilization. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to escape. Hours seemed to pass. The man made occasional comments about places we had passed or people he knew along the route, but nothing about them made sense. It was like he was talking in riddles, fragments of stories that didn't add up. I started to regret ever getting into the truck, wishing I had waited for another ride or even walked along the road despite the chill. At one point, he pulled off the road into a clearing. "Need to take a break," he said. I didn't want to, but I didn't see another option. He parked the truck and got out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I stayed inside, heart pounding, watching the shadows of the trees stretch long and thin in the fading light. The forest felt alive, closing in around us, and the isolation was suffocating. I heard him moving through the underbrush, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Something about the sound made me certain he wasn't alone in the forest. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything else, and then I heard it. A low, guttural growl followed by a scuffling sound. My stomach churned. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. I considered opening the truck door and running, but the thought of leaving my backpack and getting caught froze me in place. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, he returned to the truck, carrying nothing. But he seemed different, calmer, more deliberate in his movements. He didn't speak much after that, just drove on, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. The darkness of the night deepened, and I could barely see the road ahead except for the dim glow of the headlights. Somewhere near the Ohio border, I noticed a rest area coming up. My heart leapt. I had to find a way to get out of the truck without alerting him. As we approached the exit, I feigned interest in the scenery and subtly unbuckled my seatbelt. When he parked at the rest area, I pretended to stretch and asked if I could use the restroom. He nodded, distracted by a text on his phone. I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the truck, running toward the lit restrooms as fast as I could. My legs burned, my chest heaving, but adrenaline carried me forward. I didn't look back until I was inside the restroom, locked the door, and slid down against the wall. I could hear the distant hum of his truck as it drove off, leaving me trembling in the cold, fluorescent-lit building. I stayed at the rest area until the sun began to rise, shaking and exhausted. Eventually, a state trooper pulled in to check on the parking lot. I ran to him, breathless and terrified, explaining everything. He radioed for backup, and after a few tense hours, they confirmed that the man had a long history of assaults and abductions. I later learned that I had narrowly escaped a man who had been wanted for multiple disappearances along highways across several states. The experience left me scarred. I stopped hitchhiking entirely after that day, relying instead on buses or rides with people I knew personally. The memory of the man's cold eyes, his probing questions, and the eerie quiet of that forested road stayed with me for years. I still have nightmares about sitting in that truck, trapped with nowhere to run, feeling the creeping certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Even now, when I drive along empty highways at night, I find myself checking the rearview mirror a little more often, scanning for any sign of a stranger offering a ride. The freedom and adventure that once drew me to hitchhiking have been replaced by a deep, lingering caution. I know now how quickly curiosity and naivety can put you in danger, and I carry that lesson with me every time I step onto the road. Looking back, I realize how small decisions, a smile, a nod, a moment of politeness, can spiral into life-threatening situations. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't found the courage to run at the rest area. I still hear the crunching of leaves in my mind, the echo of his voice, and the feeling of that metallic smell in the air. It's a memory that has refused to fade, a dark imprint left on my psyche that reminds me of the fragility of safety and the unpredictability of human nature. Even years later, friends who know the story will ask me why I hitchhike so rarely, and I tell them simply that some roads are best walked alone, some strangers are best left unspoken to, and some stories are best remembered as warnings. It's a lesson learned in the most terrifying way possible, one that continues to influence how I navigate the world, how I judge trust, and how I perceive danger on the open road. That day on Route 50 in West Virginia, I learned that horror doesn't always come in the form of monsters or ghosts. Sometimes it wears the face of a man who seems ordinary, who smiles, who talks, and whose presence can turn the freedom of the road into a living nightmare. Story the end. It was a late September evening in rural Kentucky when I found myself standing by the side of Highway 68, thumb out, hoping for a ride. I had been visiting a friend in Lexington, and my car had broken down about 20 miles outside town. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, leaving streaks of red and purple across the sky, and the air had that sharp bite of early fall. I had no signal on my phone and no way to call for help. The highway was quiet, the occasional car passing me with indifferent speed, and I felt the creeping isolation of the woods pressing in from both sides of the road. After about 30 minutes, a beat-up white pickup truck slowed down. Its paint was chipped, the tires coated in dried mud. The driver, a man in his early 40s with a weathered face and unshaven stubble, rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice low but friendly enough. "Yes, please. I'm trying to get back to Lexington." I replied, careful not to sound too desperate. "Hop in," he said, gesturing to the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of cigarettes and oil. I climbed in, grateful for the warmth. The engine rumbled as he merged back onto the road. At first, the conversation was mundane, small talk about the weather, the route, and local traffic. But soon the man started asking questions that made me uneasy. "So you hitchhike often?" he asked, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. "Not really," I said. "This is kind of a one-time thing." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Just tonight?" he asked, almost as if testing me. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, just tonight." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. I noticed the road narrowing, the occasional bend taking us deeper into a stretch of highway that I didn't recognize. Trees loomed over the road, their branches scratching at the sides of the truck. My chest tightened and I felt that instinctual prickle of fear. Are you sure this is the way?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Shortcut," he said, not looking at me. "Trust me." I nodded, but the unease grew. Minutes passed, then the pavement turned to dirt, narrow and winding through thick woods. The headlights barely illuminated the road, and I realized I had no idea where I was. My heart pounded, and the metallic scent of the truck, oil, rust, something else I couldn't identify, made my stomach churn. Maybe we should turn back," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond. Just kept driving, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground. Shadows from the trees flickered across his face, making his expression hard to read. I tried to focus on my breathing, but every instinct screamed that I was in danger. After what felt like hours, though was likely only minutes, he suddenly stopped the truck. I lurched forward, gripping the seat. He stepped out and opened the back of the truck briefly before returning to the cab. "Just a little stop," he said. "Stretch my legs." I didn't move. My throat went dry, and my mind raced. The door was locked, my phone had no signal, and I was surrounded by dense forest. I realized I had no clear way to escape. He walked into the darkness, and I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Then, a low growl, somewhere between human and animal, echoed through the trees. My skin crawled, and I pressed myself as far back into the seat as possible. Finally, he returned. Sliding into the cab without a word, he drove on in silence. My heart hammered, and I kept glancing at him, searching for any sign of humanity in that pale, calculating face. The metallic smell in the cab had grown stronger. I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, that he had planned this. We drove further into the woods, the dirt path twisting unnaturally. I could barely see the road through the canopy of branches. My panic grew with every mile. I considered jumping out of the moving truck, but the ground was uneven, and I had no sense of direction or safety. Every instinct screamed to run, but I had no choice but to stay inside, hoping for an opportunity. Eventually, the path widened into a small clearing. There, an old, abandoned farmhouse appeared, its windows boarded, the paint peeling and the yard overgrown. My stomach dropped. "This is—" "What?" I whispered. "You'll see," he said, voice flat and emotionless. I shook my head. "I'm not going in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You're already here," he said. "Might as well." I realized the seriousness of my situation. The door was locked, and I had no way to call for help. I pounded on the door, screamed, but the forest swallowed my cries. He stepped out, moving toward me, and I bolted into the trees without thinking. Branches scratched my arms and face, and the uneven ground tripped me several times. I ran blindly, adrenaline driving me forward. I could hear him behind me, boots crunching over leaves, deliberate and unhurried, enjoying the chase. Hours seemed to pass. I stumbled upon a creek and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a road. Exhausted, soaked, and trembling, I finally reached a secondary road. A truck appeared, headlights piercing the darkness. I ran into the road, waving frantically. The driver stopped, and I collapsed into the cab. Between sobs and gasps, I told him everything. He listened in silence, and then drove me to the nearest police station. The officers took my statement seriously, but there was little they could do. The man, the truck, the abandoned house, everything was gone. No trace remained. Later, I learned that similar disappearances had been reported along rural Kentucky roads over the years. Hitchhikers and travelers vanished without a trace, their cases unsolved. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow, every unexpected noise, every dark stretch of road reminded me of that night. I stopped going out alone, avoided back roads, and became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Years later, I read news about another hitchhiker disappearing under similar circumstances. Details were eerily familiar. Dark truck, forested path, abandoned structure. My stomach sank. Even now, decades later, I drive cautiously along dark, rural roads. My hands grip the wheel tightly, eyes scanning the tree line. Sometimes I swear I catch a glimpse of a white truck in the distance, or a shadow moving between the trees. The memory of that night, the metallic scent, the growl in the forest, the cold calculation in his eyes, still haunts me. I know the predator is out there, patient, waiting for the next traveler to make a fatal mistake. Hitchhiking taught me the harshest lesson about trust and danger, about how quickly an ordinary decision can turn into a nightmare. I will never forget that night, and I will never hitchhike again. Every time I see someone standing alone on a rural road, thumb out, I feel a chill. I know how close I came to being another missing person in a story that no one may ever fully know, and I know that luck saved me that night, luck that is far too rare. Story the end. It was a Thursday afternoon when I decided to hitchhike out of Kansas City. I was 23, broke, and impatiently waiting for a friend to get off work so we could go camping in the Ozarks. He was driving down from St. Louis, and I figured it would be faster to catch a ride part of the way than meet him halfway. The interstate was busy enough that cars zipped past me without hesitation, but not so crowded that I felt invisible. I stuck out my thumb at the edge of the shoulder, hopeful and restless. The first few drivers gave nothing more than glances. One man slowed slightly, shook his head, and then sped off. I was already feeling that familiar creeping anxiety that comes from standing on asphalt with your thumb up, hoping a stranger would offer help. I checked my phone. Battery at 20%. No signal. Perfect. Just perfect. I looked down the road, squinting against the glaring afternoon sun, and that's when I saw the truck. It was a dark blue, older model Ford pickup, the kind that looked like it had been around the country a few times. It slowed gradually, almost reluctantly, and finally pulled to a stop a few feet away from me. The driver's window rolled down, and a man's face appeared. He looked older, maybe mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. His eyes were a pale green, almost gray, and the way he studied me felt unsettling. "Going far?" he asked, his voice low but friendly enough. Just about halfway to the Ozarks," I said, motioning toward my map on the dashboard. He nodded slowly. "Hop in. I'm heading that way too." Something in the way he said it didn't quite sit right, but I was tired of waiting, tired of the heat, and impatient to get moving. I climbed into the passenger seat and we started down the highway. The cab smelled faintly of old smoke and something sour, like spoiled milk. I wrinkled my nose, trying not to notice too much. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. He fiddled with the radio, which was stuck on some country station, static and all. The music was low, almost drowned out by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. I decided to make small talk. "So, you live around here?" I asked. He glanced at me briefly, then back to the road. "Sorta. Travel a lot for work. Pick up odd jobs, haul stuff from here to there." "Cool," I said, trying not to sound nervous. There was something about his smile, forced, uneven, that made my stomach tighten. After a few more miles, he pulled off at an unmarked exit down a narrow road flanked by trees that cast long shadows over the asphalt. "Shortcut," he said. "Trust me." I hesitated. This wasn't the route my map suggested, but I didn't exactly have a better option and didn't want to argue. I nodded. We drove through the winding road for a while. I tried to make conversation again. "So, what kind of hauling do you usually do?" He laughed softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "All kinds. Some stuff I can talk about, some I can't. You ever hear about the old mill outside of Clay County?" I shook my head. "That's where a lot of special deliveries go. Nothing illegal, mostly. Just unusual. People don't like it being known." I nodded, trying to hide the chill creeping up my spine. His words were vague but heavy, weighted in a way that made me uncomfortable. I looked out the window at the trees, their branches scraping the sides of the truck as if to warn me. The road narrowed and the pavement turned to cracked gravel. We passed a few abandoned buildings, a gas station with boarded windows, a small farmhouse with rusted metal siding. My unease started to rise. "Are we still on the highway?" I asked. "Highway's that way," he said, pointing back. "But this is faster. You'll see." We drove for another 20 minutes through the thickening woods. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched unnaturally long across the road. Then I noticed something. He wasn't looking at the road as much anymore. He kept glancing at me, smirking faintly whenever I caught his gaze. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice tighter than intended. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll get there." A sense of panic began to grow. My instincts screamed at me, but I kept it buried under a polite tone. "You mind if I use my phone?" I asked. "No signal here," he said, nodding toward the dead tree line beyond the windows. "Nothing but the trees." My stomach dropped. I realized just how isolated we were. There were no other cars, no signs of life, nothing but the truck, the gravel road, and the forest. I tried to calm myself. "Okay, so how long have you been doing this work?" I asked, trying to divert the conversation. He smiled again, the kind of smile that made your skin crawl. "Long enough to know when someone's curious." My throat tightened. I swallowed. "Curious about what?" He didn't answer, just drove in silence, occasionally glancing at me from the corner of his eye. I tried to focus on the passing trees, forcing myself to breathe normally. Then he slowed the truck, bringing it to a stop near a clearing. The clearing was overgrown, wild, and at its center was an old, dilapidated barn. The boards were splintered, the roof sagging, the air smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like rusted blood. I froze. What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me slowly. "You ever hear about people disappearing around here?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I've read stories." "Stories are fun," he said, stepping out of the truck. "Reality's different." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm and pulled me out. His grip was stronger than it looked, but he wasn't physically rough, more insistent. He led me toward the barn. My mind raced. I considered bolting, but the thick woods and his size made that seem impossible. Inside, the barn was dark, the air heavy and stale. Shadows danced across the walls from the slats in the rotting wood. I could make out objects stacked haphazardly. Crates, barrels, tarps covering unidentifiable shapes. "Sit," he said, motioning toward an old wooden chair in the center of the barn. "Just sit." I obeyed, frozen. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. He circled me slowly, a predator studying its prey. "You're brave for a hitchhiker," he said. "Most people run when they see the path I take them down." What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He chuckled. "Want? Nothing. Yet. Maybe something. Maybe just a story." I didn't understand. "A story?" He nodded. "Yeah, people like you. You're like me sometimes. Curious. Willing. You see the edge and want to peek over." I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead. The fear was paralyzing. He leaned closer, whispering now. "Ever hear about the disappearances in the Ozarks, the ones they never solved?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "I've read about them." He smiled, a slow, thin smile. "You're lucky. You'll be part of the story. Not the one that ends bad, maybe." I couldn't tell if he was joking. Panic surged. I had to do something. My hands clenched into fists. My heart raced so fast I could hear it in my ears. And then, as if reading my thoughts, he laughed. A cold, hollow sound. "You're thinking of running. That's smart. Most people do." Without thinking, I bolted for the door. I felt the scrape of the old wood under my fingers as I pushed it open and ran blindly into the clearing. My lungs burned. My feet pounded against the gravel, the forest looming on both sides. I didn't look back. I just ran, weaving through trees, stumbling over roots until I reached the main road. My lungs were on fire, my shirt torn, but I made it to the asphalt. Cars whizzed past me, none stopping. I stuck out my thumb frantically, desperate. After what felt like an eternity, a man in a white van slowed. I jumped in without thinking, slamming the door behind me. I didn't speak for the first few minutes, just shaking, gasping for breath. "Hey, you okay?" the man asked. His voice was calm, normal, and I realized I could finally breathe. I need to get out of here," I said, pointing back toward the woods. "Please, just drive. Anywhere but there." He nodded. "All right, just relax. You're safe now." As we drove away, I saw the truck at the edge of the clearing. The man in the flannel and cap was standing there, watching us. and then he waved. I didn't look back again. I made it to my friend's campsite a few hours later. I told him I had been delayed, spun some story about car trouble. I didn't tell him what really happened. Some things are better left unsaid. But even now, years later, whenever I'm on the highway, waiting for a ride or glancing at the shadows on a lonely stretch of road, I remember those pale green eyes and the cold, knowing smile. I never hitchhiked again. Story the end. It was a late summer evening when I decided to hitchhike back home from college. I had spent the weekend with friends in Little Rock, and Sunday night had rolled in far too quickly, leaving me stranded without a ride. My parents' house in rural Arkansas was a good 3-hour drive away, and I didn't feel like paying for a bus that would force me to leave at dawn. So I stuck out my thumb on Highway 64, hoping someone decent would pass by. The traffic was sparse, but eventually a battered brown Ford pickup slowed down. The windows were grimy, and I could barely see the driver through the dust streaked across the glass. The driver waved me over with a crooked finger. I hesitated for a second. Something about the truck felt off, but I was young, impatient, and naive. I climbed into the cab, the vinyl seat sticking to my jeans in the heat. "Evenin', son. Where you headed?" The voice was deep, gruff, and slightly slurred. "Just a few towns over. Arkansas," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, shifting gears, and started driving. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, which seemed unnecessary in the fading light. The radio played a country station quietly, but he didn't tap along or sing, just stared straight ahead, driving too slowly for the road conditions. I asked the usual questions to make small talk, school, work, weather, but his responses were short, clipped, almost rehearsed. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The sun disappeared, and the trees lining the road grew taller, denser, swallowing the fading light. Every mile seemed to take longer than the last. I noticed we hadn't passed another car for what felt like forever. This seems out of the way," I said cautiously. He didn't answer. The silence grew thick, almost tangible. I swallowed hard and tried again. "Do you know a faster route?" He glanced at me through the mirror then, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. His face was pale under the dim glow of the dashboard, and his eyes, dark, empty, locked onto mine. "Faster isn't always better," he said, his voice low. The road curved sharply, and the truck slowed onto a dirt path that branched off from the main highway. My heart thumped. "Wait, where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "You'll see," he replied, his tone casual, but the way he said it made me uneasy. The dirt road led deeper into thick woods. I couldn't see the sky anymore. The trees had formed a dark canopy above us. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the shadows. I tried to open the door once, but it was locked. Panic started to bubble in my chest. I thought about kicking the window, screaming, anything, but my legs felt heavy, frozen. The truck came to a sudden stop in a clearing. The engine cut out, leaving us in a silence so absolute it pressed against my eardrums. "Get out," he said. My stomach turned. "What? Why?" "Just get out. Stretch your legs." Something about the way he said it, casual but commanding, made me comply. I opened the door and stepped onto the wet, soft dirt. The smell of decaying leaves hit me immediately, thick and cloying. The clearing was small, encircled by towering pines. I could barely see the truck behind me. Then I heard it, a low, metallic scraping like chains being dragged. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the truck. I turned slowly, and in the dim light, I caught a glimpse of the trailer attached to the pickup. Something moved inside it. Something alive. I stumbled back. "What is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He just watched me, leaning casually against the truck. Then the scraping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that whatever it was in the trailer, it was moving toward me, or at least it seemed to. My first instinct was to run, but the uneven ground, the roots, and the wet leaves made every step a struggle. Finally, I sprinted. Branches slapped against my face and tore my clothes as I ran blindly into the darkness, following what I hoped was the faint outline of the road. Behind me, the scraping and a low guttural growl echoed through the trees. I tripped, landing hard on my knees, and felt hands, or something like hands, grab at my ankles. I kicked and twisted, finally breaking free. After what felt like hours, I burst onto a road. My lungs burned, and my clothes were soaked in mud and sap. A lone sedan passed by, and I waved my arms frantically. The driver slowed, rolled down the window. "You okay?" she asked. "Please, just drive. Don't stop," I gasped. She looked at me, horrified, but unlocked the door, letting me in. I told her as much as I could about the man, the trailer, but it sounded like nonsense even to me. We drove until we reached a town with gas stations and streetlights. I thanked her over and over, hands shaking as I stepped out. I never reported it. I didn't know how to explain it. Who would believe me? The police would think I was making it up, or worse, that I had been hallucinating. But I knew what I had seen. The pale man. The dark, empty eyes. The scraping from the trailer. It wasn't imagination. I could still feel it in my chest. The fear, the adrenaline, the instinct that had kept me moving when my body wanted to collapse. Days later, I read a story online about a hitchhiker who had gone missing on a road just like the one I had been on. Some said he'd been abducted. Others whispered of serial killers or cults hiding in the woods. I didn't want to know for sure. I didn't want to connect the dots between that story and my own narrow escape. But deep down, I knew. I had gotten lucky. Even now, when I drive alone on empty roads, especially late at night, I feel the same knot of fear in my stomach. The memory of that pale man, his empty eyes, and the dragging metal of the trailer follows me like a shadow. I've told a few close friends over the years, but nobody can understand unless they've been there, and I hope nobody ever is. I never hitchhike again. I can't. Even the thought makes my skin crawl. Some people stop to help, some people just drive by, but others, they wait. They watch. They lure. And sometimes they let you go, only to remind you that they could have done worse. I think about that night constantly, about the silence, the darkness, and the sound that followed me through the trees. I know it could have ended differently. I know others weren't so lucky, and I know, even after all these years, that on some dark, empty highway, the man in the brown Ford pickup might still be out there, looking for the next kid with their thumb stuck out. I still remember the scraping of the chains, the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the chill that ran down my spine the moment I realized I wasn't alone. And I remember running, always running. Even after everything, I can't forget it. I can't shake the feeling that the world isn't as safe as we're told, that out there, on some stretch of highway, someone is waiting, watching. And if you're not careful, they won't let you leave. I've learned to be wary, to never accept a ride from a stranger, to trust instincts that scream danger before the brain can rationalize it. But the memory of that night, the fear, the adrenaline, the sound that chased me through the woods, it lingers. And I know that somewhere, someone else might be out there, just like me, forced to run through the night, praying for survival against a horror they didn't see coming. I'll never forget the eyes, the trailer, the scraping. I'll never forget the silence that swallowed me whole before the chase began. And I'll never forget the fear that has never truly left me, even now. Story the end.